We are continuing our series on Arizona. Catch up by watching our previous videos if you have not already. It's now 1910. Phoenix is at 11,134 and Tucson at 13,193 people. The Dawes Act of 1887 is applied to Salt River, dividing tribal peoples into allotments that had no irrigation rights from the canal. Any surprises there? In 1912, 2 years later, Arizona becomes the 48th state. In 1914, Papago Park, which had been a reservation, was now the Papago Saguaro National Monument. The first allotments of land within Crick, Gila River Indian Community, were established as an attempt to break up communal lands and force onto tribal peoples the Western concept of private landholding. In 1918, Matthew B. Juan Bott was the first Arizonan killed in World War I. He was from the Gila River Indian Community. In 1919, the Grand Canyon National Park was established despite being the home to various tribal nations. 4 years later, and in that general region of northern Arizona, traditional Navajo leadership is dissolved. Oil is found and a new council was created so the federal government and corporations could sign over mineral leases. This initiates a dependency on extractive resources for employment, despite health risks and traditional beliefs. The nuclear era around World War II sees a rise in uranium exploitation, impacting tribal waters and health issues in Native employees. The BIA manages all mineral leases on tribal lands. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act passes. Allegedly, all indigenous peoples in the U.S. for the first time may be members of their tribal nations and citizens of the U.S. Previously, they would have to have relinquished one for another. While some say, finally, others argue this was just an attempt to get rid of tribes and force further assimilation. Even so, Native Americans were still denied the right to vote by the state of Arizona and others, and it would remain that way for quite some time. In 1924, the San Carlos Project Act authorized the construction of water storage dams on the Gila River. It failed to revitalize the O'odham farming economy, halted Gila River waters, and initiated more years of famine that some believe was a masked attempt at mass genocide. In 1925, the Mormon Flat Dam was completed, and so water withholding continued. In 1929, the Heard Museum in Phoenix was founded from a personal collection of art, much of which came from archaeological materials stolen from the Siojad Indian ruins, which the Heards purchased in 1926 in Phoenix. The Indian Art Act would not be passed to protect such exploitation of indigenous goods until 1990. Arizona's tourism soared in 1929 as well. Coupled with the lack of rights in indigenous communities, it became clear Arizonans wanted to profit off of Native Americans, but did not want them to be treated like humans. It was as if the state was one giant living museum for them to observe and benefit off of, while those around them starved. In 1930, the Stewart Mountain Dam was completed and Phoenix grew to 48,118. Congress recalled Papago Park's status as a national monument, considering the area not suitable for one. It was divided among the state of Arizona, the city of Tempe, and Salt River Project, but the federal government reserved all oil, coal, and other mineral rights, of course. In 1933, the Great Depression hits Phoenix. The Pueblo Grande Museum Archaeological Park opens, featuring Native American sites. The following year, legislation adds new lands to the Navajo Reservation. They also enact the Navajo Livestock Reduction Act in a response to the Dust Bowl and sedimentation in the Colorado River. BIA agents forcibly entered Navajo lands, mass slaughtering their sacred livestock, which had finally increased since the return from the Long Walk a generation before. They admitted to killing more than could substantiate the Navajo population. Later, it was discovered that overgrazing wasn't causing silt to build up on the Colorado River. It was the construction of the Hoover Dam from 1931 to 1936 that caused the problem. It is likely they knew this, but it gave a good excuse to try yet again to remove Native American competition for water resources in the Southwest. In 1938, while Navajos are gripping with increased poverty after the Livestock Reduction Act, Arizonans are back at it again with their pleasures. The Arizona Snowball opens a skiing facility in Flagstaff on the San Francisco Peaks, one of the sacred mountains for the Navajo and other tribes in the area. Now comes World War II, a great war in which many Native Americans fought as well, including code talkers from the following nations: Assiniboine, Cherokee, Choctaw, Comanche, Hopi, Navajo, Meskwaki, and Seminole. The Navajo code talkers were credited with America's success in the Pacific. However, they were not formally recognized in public for their work until the late 1950s, and after one of the code talkers had already passed on. They also returned to Arizona, where they were still not allowed to vote. During the war in 1941, District 6 of the 1882 Hopi lands, which was established in 1936, is expanded and Navajos are forced to move from it without compensation. In 1942, the Gila River War Relocation Center opens. It's an internment camp for Japanese Americans on the Gila River Indian Reservation on the south side of Phoenix. It becomes the fourth largest city in Arizona in 5 months. At the same time, an abandoned BIA boarding school in Loop on the Navajo Nation is transformed into the Loop Isolation Center to hold Japanese American internees as well. The other major location, the Post-War Relocation Center, was built on the Colorado River Indian Reservation along the California border. From 1924 to 1944, Papago Park housed a prisoner of war camp, the site of the largest mass escape in a U.S. prison camp in World War II. But the prisoners turned themselves in when they could not survive in the desert. The site was later converted to a VA hospital and an Army Reserve facility. You see, Arizona hides many secrets. We made a video about the termination and relocation eras from 1945 to 1960 or so. Arizona was not untouched at this time either. From the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s, U.S. policy was Indian termination, shaped by a series of laws and policies with the intent of further assimilating Native Americans into mainstream American society. The policy ended the U.S. government's recognition of sovereignty of tribes, trusteeship over Indian reservations, and exclusion of law applicability to Native persons. Tribes could file claims against the government for treaty breaches and grievances through the Indian Claims Commission by a 5-year deadline. More than 100 tribes were terminated in the eyes of the U.S. government. When President Lyndon B. Johnson proposed ending termination in 1968, many tribes began fighting for restoration despite a lack of funds from ongoing legal battles during this era. Some have achieved re-recognition since then, some still have not. In 1948, federal courts overturned state laws prohibiting Indians from voting in Maine, Arizona, and New Mexico, but violence, economic retaliation, and other legal tricks continued to be used to keep Native Americans from voting in the U.S. and state elections, even for those who had contributed to Allied victory in World War II. The 1950s saw widespread use of air conditioning, leading to a construction and population boom in Phoenix during a difficult era for Native Americans in federal policy. In 1955, Ira A. Hayes Bott, known for raising the flag on Iwo Jima and from the Gila River Indian community, is found dead of exposure near Saskatoon. These two stark images of Phoenicians living comfortably and a war hero left to the elements is symbolic of the era. The next year, the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 passed, and federal law encouraged Native Americans who lived on or near Indian reservations to relocate to urban areas for greater employment opportunities. Under the guise of helping, it was really just a way to further destroy tribal communities and assimilate members into American society. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, as many as 750,000 Native Americans migrated to the cities as part of the program. By 2000, the urban Indian population would be 64% higher than it had been in pre-termination era of the 1940s. That is why today there are even substantial Native populations in places like the Rust Belt city of Cleveland, Ohio, where tribal members from the western states relocated for work. With the civil rights movement came a reversal of previous eras and a push for tribal self-determination across the nation. In Arizona in the 1960s, the Peabody Energy Company began a land dispute and even held false Hopi elections to obtain mineral rights and aquifer use for strip mines at Black Mesa and Kayenta. Perhaps we will do this video at another time, but for more information, search YouTube for Broken Rainbow. It's an older but excellent documentary about mineral exploitation of the Hopi and Navajo. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that the disputed area would be joint use. In 1966, the Bennett Freeze occurred as part of the land dispute. It was a development ban placed on 1.5 million acres of Navajo lands by the U.S. federal government, generating images you can Google of poverty and of homes abandoned. And this ban was not lifted until Obama did so in 2009. Let's pause one more time. Our next video will illustrate the most recent generation of Arizona history for Indigenous peoples. As always, be sure to subscribe, provide feedback or requests, and share this channel so we can all be on the same page.